Our next speaker is Susan Silver, a comedy writer for the Mary Tyler Moore Show, for Maude, for Bob Newhart and others, an NPR commentator. It's a pleasure to welcome Susan here to the platform.
It's really an honor to be here. I recently lost a very dear friend of more than 40 years who happened to be Marty Garbus's best friend. His name was Gary Marshall. He was my mentor and my manager, and he was a comedy icon too. And he used to say he wanted to be the recess in the school day of comedy. He wanted to be the light, fun, no heavy message, not serious, academic kind of thing. And I look around at all of you serious, brilliant academicians, and so I'm the recess of this conference. Because the reason I'm here is Lenny Bruce's mother fixed me up with him when I was in college. And I want to go like this and say I'm blonde, but one other thing Gary said, in show business we have a term that's called hyphenates. You're a director slash producer, a writer slash director, an actor slash waiter, usually. Anyway, when I retired from show business, I got very involved with Holocaust-related things. I worked for the Anti-Defamation League, I ran their Speakers Bureau, and I was the UN observer for the Simon Wiesenthal Center. So Gary said I was the original hyphenate, sitcom writer slash Nazi hunter. So I guess I do fit in here because I see we have panels on the Holocaust and humor. I've just finished my memoir about being a woman in a man's world, about being a woman writing in the sort of beginning of feminism where comedy changed because, hopefully, of Mary Tyler Moore. But another thing in my book is I'm like Zelig, and I should say Ms. Zelig. I have encountered in my life every icon of my generation. It's kind of scary. I was in show business, I was in politics, and I'm kind of always in the right place at the right time, and as you can see, I'm not very shy, so it all worked out very well. We have to remember, as Christy said, the times we were living in. This was the early 60s, I'm much older than I look. And it was a time where, don't forget, on television, married couples were not even allowed to be shown in the same bed. They had to sleep in separate beds. We didn't even really know what feminism was until 1970 or 1962 when Betty Friedan wrote her book. And I grew up in a double bind of that. I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is about as Midwest a person you could be. And when I grew up, all my friends wanted to go to college to get their MRS, or they'd be a teacher. I wanted to go to Hollywood and be a writer. But being an only child in a Jewish protective home, I wasn't allowed to cross the main street until I was 12. So I could only get to Northwestern my first 2 years. And then I escaped to Hollywood, to California, Sin City. I had an uncle out there who was also a famous writer, director, producer, and man about town. His name was Cy Howard, and I was living with him. If my parents only knew what it was like there, they never would have sent me, but that's another story, which we'll have a reference to Lenny in a minute. In doing research on Lenny, since I was going to be speaking from my personal experience, I found a really great article he did for Playboy in 1963 about what would happen if he had to play in Milwaukee. And of course, I wouldn't have been allowed to see him, but I just want to read a few pages of this article. It's so great, and it also shows how strange it was for this little Jewish virgin to meet Lenny Bruce. Let's say I'm working at the Crescendo, Lenny says. You know, I'll finish a show, some guy will come up to me and say, I'm a club owner, I'd like you to work for me. It's a beautiful club. You ever work in Milwaukee? Lots of people you know there. I mean, you'll do great, you'll kill them. You'll have a lot of fun. Do you bowl? The only thing is, I know that those clubs between Los Angeles and New York, the people in the audience are a little older than me. The most I can say to people over 50 is, thank you, I've had enough to eat. So I get to Milwaukee. The first thing that frightens me to death is they've got a 6:30 dinner show. And this was the home of, my parents were always talking about the early bird special. 6:30, Lenny says, in the afternoon, people are going to a nightclub. It's not even dark yet. I don't want to go in the house. It's not dark yet, man. If the dinner show is held up, it's only because the jello's not hard. The people look familiar, but I've never been to Milwaukee before. Then I realize These are the gray line sightseeing bus tours before they leave. It's where they come from. They're like 40-year-old chicks with prom gowns on. They don't laugh, they don't heckle, they just stare at me in disbelief. And there are walkouts every night. The owner says to me, well, I never saw you do that religious bit and those words you use. The chef is confused, the desserts aren't moving. I go to the men's room. I see kids in there, kids, 4 years old, kids. The kids are in awe of the men's room. This is the first time they've been in a place their mother isn't allowed to go in. Come on out. No, I'm going to come in and get you. No, you're not allowed in here because everybody's doing making wet in here. In between the shows, I'm a walker. I'm getting nervous, and nudgy. The owner decides to cushion me in his next introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, the star of our show, Lenny Bruce. He's incidentally a GI, an ex-GI, a hell of a good performer, folks. A great kidder, you know? It's all a bunch of silliness up here. He doesn't mean what he says. He kids about the Pope, about Jewish religion, about colored people, white people. It's silly, it's a make-believe. He's a hell of a nice guy. He was at the Veterans Hospital today for a show. He did a show for the boys. Here he is. His mother's here. He's probably from here. She lives here in town, really. Now, a joke is a joke, right, folks? What the hell? I wish that you'd try to cooperate. Whoever has been sticking ice picks in the tires outside, it's not funny. Now, Lenny may kid about narcotics, homosexuality, things like that, and he gets walkouts. So that's the world I came from. And there I was, this little scared Jewish virgin, the night I met Lenny Bruce. So there's only one person who has their own chapter in my book of all the famous people, that's Lenny Bruce. This is my chapter on Lenny. It's New Year's Eve, 1964, 1965, I can't remember. I was out with a group of friends at someone's house, and a lively older woman was entertaining us. She was Sally Marr, a former stripper, but best known as the mother of Lenny Bruce. Lenny, the brilliant but troubled comedian, single-handedly changed comedy with his stream of consciousness, his cultural critique. He didn't tell jokes, he told truths. Dramatic-looking, with dark, soulful eyes and a sad smile, he was someone I admired, and yes, had a crush on. Imagine my joy and alarm when Lenny's mother took a liking to me and said, "You should meet my son. I'm going to call him and tell him to come to the party." What? Lenny Bruce, controversial, potentially dangerous, possibly druggy, coming to meet a Jewish virgin? Oi. Okay, as long as no one tells my mother. His mother did call him and he came. I wondered why he didn't have a better place to be on New Year's Eve. He walked in and it was smitten at first sight, on my side at least. I sat at his feet with a bunch of other girls as he mulled different topics. He pointed to the angels peeking out from the filigreed borders of the ceiling. According to Lenny, they now look shocked as they listened to him. We thought this was a brilliant observation, having not even noticed them ourselves. Everything he said was brilliant, and by the end of the evening, I was in love, or some crush-like facsimile thereof. He asked for my number and said maybe I could come down to his show the following week at the club he played in Hollywood called the Crescendo. I said, yes, of course. Then I called my uncle. By that time, I was living in an apartment, but I remained close to him, and he said, no way. This guy is way too dangerous for you. I asked why. He listed about 10 reasons, and then he said if I insisted on going out with Lenny Bruce, he was coming along as chaperone, and he did. He went with me to the show, which was racy, a little scary, and amazing. My uncle really admired Lenny. I was kind of glad that he had accompanied me, because now I was really scared to death. The secret garden beckoned. We waited at the bar. When Lenny emerged, we all had a drink. He and my uncle got along famously. I sat there, not saying a word, out of my element, and Lenny went and he wrote something on a napkin, and he handed it to me with a smile. It was a little drawing, an arrow with writing along before it bent around, and it said, Susan will go to the corner, but she's afraid to go around. Wow, was it that evident? After we talked a while, he went backstage and brought out a few pages of one of his routines and gave them to me. He signed it, Clark Gable Found Alive in Argentina. Love Lenny Bruce. It turned out to be the famous bit about how to make your colored friends comfortable at parties. You're supposed to drop names like Uncle Ben, oh, I love that rice, Aunt Jemima, oh, the maple syrup. You drop that into the conversation. It was classic and became a collector's item, which I never would have sold, of course. Years later, it was stolen from my house in California. I was shocked when, not too long after our date, Lenny Bruce died. He OD'd in a gruesome way alone in his bathroom. He had been dating another Jewish college girl named Lotus Weinstock, who was a comic. My uncle couldn't stop from saying, I told you so. Frankly, thank God he had, or who knows what kind of trouble I'd have gotten into. But truth be told, I wanted to take care of him. He had the most soulful eyes. He was so gentle, and he was a gentleman. He knew that he scared me to death, and he gave me a graceful way out. Now, a few years later, I worked with Mort Saul, who we've talked about. Mort was not a sweet soul. He still isn't. He's on Twitter now doing his routine in a chair. It's bizarre. Anyway, I worked for 6 months. I started when I was assistant. By the end of the 6 months, everybody ahead of me had been fired, and I was the producer of his talk show, because you weren't allowed to talk when Mort talked, or you weren't allowed to do anything that annoyed him. We became friends later, but anyway, Mort told the story of how he and Lenny used to work together upstairs and downstairs of a club, and half the time Lenny was arrested, so Mort had to go and do his show both places. Then later in my career, I worked with Marvin Worth, who was kind of the take care of the estate of Lenny, and he produced the movie, in which Dustin Hoffman did a good job. But I always wanted to tell Marvin, who thought Lenny was the sweetest, kindest person he ever knew, Dustin Hoffman was not nearly as sexy as Lenny was.